Rick Anderson is a fire ecologist and descendant of the Kissimmee River Valley's earliest pioneers. For over 3 decades, he served as a fire manager in 8 national park areas across the U.S., including Everglades National Park. Currently, Rick works as an international fire management consultant with projects in Mexico, Belize, and the Caribbean islands of Trinidad and Tobago. He resides at Palmetto Island Ranch in Venus, Florida. Let's welcome Mr. Anderson.
It's good to see everyone here. As an old gray fire dog and having attended some of the earliest council meetings, it's quite amazing to see this aggregation of people and practitioners here in Florida. As mentioned in my introduction, I do fire in a lot of different places. In addition to my work internationally, where I mostly work for United Nations, United States Forest Service international programs, and several other funding agencies. I also do quite a bit of training for the Department of Defense, who is now online to do considerable amount of prescribed fire. Matter of fact, I think probably the Department of Defense does more prescribed fire than anyone in the nation. One of the things that advantages and disadvantages is the amount of travel I have to do. But I have to tell you a quick little observation is that I was traveling, I think in February, from Tucson, Arizona, where I was teaching a class, back to Florida, and you change planes somewhere to get down to the closest airport where I'm from is Fort Myers. And one of the things I see routinely, especially this class is taught in February, once I cross into East Texas, you start seeing smoke columns. A little more in Louisiana. And as you make that arc across the Gulf, you can see the horizon in Florida if it's one of those bluebird days where smoke is emitting from the ground. And it's quite a beautiful thing to see, especially since I've been teaching a class with a bunch of federal folks in the western part of the United States, trying to encourage them to do their burning so we won't hemorrhage millions of dollars of American taxpayers' money on the ground in California. I was sitting next to a woman who was looking out the window, and she goes, as we started to approach Fort Myers, and the smoke columns were out in the swamps and in the flatwoods out there, she looked at me and she goes, you know, Florida's weird. And I thought, well, where is this going? The People's Republic of Florida. It was like, what kind of weird are you talking about? That she said, the clouds just come up from the ground. And of course, I know a lot of you are in outreach business and want to talk about prescribed fire and stuff like that. I have to tell you, I don't. I just said, yeah, Florida's weird that way. Yeah, the clouds just come out of the ground. So anyway, I wanted to tell that little story and to get into a little subject called fire effects monitoring. I see you starting to yawn right now, but we're going to take a little trip through the world of mostly fire ecology and fire effects. One of the great privileges that I've had in my life is I've always been involved in fire since I was a young child. I grew up in flatwoods and palmetto prairies here. It warmed my heart to see the presentation about burning on horseback, because that's how I started. I didn't see a drip torch till I went to work for the Florida Forest Service when I was about 19 years old, because you know what we were doing. We were flipping matches. And I would advocate that because you get to learn the fuels really well. You get to learn fire effects and all the things that was stated. Fire to me is an art and a science as well, even though I've spent a lot of my world in the quantitative science world, especially a lot of my career. So the way we think about fire in Florida is, no matter where I travel or where I go, I'm so proud of what y'all are doing here in Florida, because it's the best land management tool we have, but it is a land management tool. and we can provoke change in ecosystems in ways that no other land management tool can do. But I want you to start thinking about fire in a different way. And back after World War II, and you can see in this slide, the United States military was bringing a lot of goods and resources to some of the most remote parts of the world. And some of the, especially in Melanesia and the South Pacific, a lot of the indigenous people saw these planes and all these different technologies they'd never seen before coming in and dropping off loads of gear and supplies of things that items that just did not exist in their world. Well, after the military left, they started building replicas of these things, thinking that all you had to do is build these things and it would be, you would get wealthy, you would have the resources you would need. And also some of the people in the villages kind of used that to manipulate people in the way they thought about the outside world. Now you're starting to wonder already, I hope, what the F does this have to do with fire ecology, fire? But I just wanted to drop this little seed in the ground for you. We will return to this idea later, especially the if we build it, they will come mentality. We've used, and of course, I wanted to ask everyone, who of you have read recently a scientific paper about fire management, fire ecology, and that kind of thing? I got the gator arms going here in a couple of places. So, and I don't ask that question to embarrass or call anybody out, because there's truckloads of information here. You know, we have the Southern Fire Exchange, which is an excellent way to get some of that information. But a lot of you, and understandably, can easily believe that you've got most of this stuff figured out. Get your acres burned, get those palmettos knocked back, get that water oak out of there, and open up the country like your objectives do. But we have our old friend Smokey Bear here doing a little math here. Humans plus match equals dead trees. And let's remember that trees, especially in Florida, are only 1 or 2 species above the biodiversity that really where all the magic's happening. Also note in this beautiful Wendelin painting of Smokey Bear that almost all the species he's lecturing to are fire-dependent species. And also on the other side of the screen, you see a little bit of data I dug up from the good old Florida Forest Service about what woods fires do to longleaf pine. And back in that day, and I think this was probably around the 1920s, the belief that woods fires suppressed the production of longleaf pine. So we have to wonder what kind of science we're getting now that will be as antiquated as this particular slide is. That's why I say we have to trust but verify. And there are truckloads of information about fire ecology, fire effects, and fire science, not only in Florida, because we've got some great academic institutions going here, but there's so much of it. How do you actually use it? And I'm reminded, Mary Nell and I are on a integrated research management team where we aggregate large groups of scientists to do fire-related research on usually large-scale burns. We just did one out in Utah, crown fire replication. It was several thousand acres of crown fire to see the effects of crown fire on that ecosystem. But we work a lot in the longleaf systems too in the Southeast. Most of our thinking, a great deal of our thinking here in Florida came from these 3 seminal publications. The one with the red cover on it, Fire in the Forest, it's the one that started nudging agencies towards thinking about prescribed fire. And it's what's cool about that book, it's written in a personal narrative style. It's a story. It's not a lot of tables, graphs, and things like that. Where what happens is a forester stumbles upon a ranger out in the woods doing burning. And of course, the forester is saying, "What are you doing?" And the ranger explains to him how he's learned from the local population that prescribed fire is a useful tool. The guide for Southern fire, prescribed fire in Southern Forest. Anyone ever cracked this book open and taken a look at it? It's pretty cool. But if you ever wondered where these concepts of strip ignition, dot ignition, and all of that came from, especially how it got inoculated into our way of thinking about fire, it's this book here. And I can't help to be a little editorial. For all of you who believe that you're mimicking natural processes or lightning fires by lighting strip ignition or dot ignition, I'm rolling my eyes for you right now. The first time it ever occurred in nature is when Homo sapiens got a hold of a drip torch. And this book was written from a forester's point of view. So where do we get the terms burn units? Several of these other things were foresters, their forestry work started leaking into this prescribed fire management book. And also the infamous seasonal effects of prescribed burning in Florida. Has anyone read this or take a look at this? It started generating the phone game that we have about fire effects in this. None of these publications were, all these publications are quite old, but they started to seep into our thinking about things like seasonality. If you do get a hold of any of these books, and I recommend especially the prescribed fire, all of them really, what I would encourage you to do is read them carefully instead of having someone tell you this is the effects of seasonality. Because I've seen all of these books, particularly the seasonal effects of prescribed burning, misunderstood. And guess what? Since the 1980s and 1990s, when these books were revised and published, science has come a long way. For example, did you know the idea of fire return interval is now starting to collapse? The whole idea of it is starting to collapse. And there's several reasons why. I won't steal the thunder on that at this point from another researcher. But we always have to ask this idea, and this is something I'm most concerned about in Florida in the gentle way that I can be concerned about things. The idea is if we just burn it, and we burn it in the right season, the right time, wildlife will come, dogs and cats will start living together, everything will be just fine. But I think it's site-specific details are more, in other words, fire is more nuanced than that. I would be careful about taking some blanket statement about seasonality or fire effects on your piece of land, because Florida is dynamic as heck, and y'all know that. Also, something's going on with the climate. For all of you that are involved in restoration ecology, Lord help you. If we can't move this landscape back to 1491, folks, we're not going to be able to restore the CO2 levels, at least. We might restore structure and species and these things like that. And also there's winners and losers out there. You know this, that fire is a powerful force in transforming the land and its inhabitants. And one of the things I work with a lot of indigenous people in Central and South America who have a very different take on fire. It's both a spiritual thing and it's also an inheritance. I think some of us in this room may have inherited fire, but what they know is that when you light something, you transform it for ill or good. And if you're a economic disadvantaged population and you make a mistake with fire, you're going to go hungry. We can probably answer this, why we burn. You know, the obvious thing about reducing fuel loads with the idea, and I use that word, that applying fire will reduce risk to life and property and ecosystems. For all of you that track things like KBDI, you probably know that we've had some large-scale fires when the KBDI was like quite low. And also, for example, in some of your sites, if you did not burn it for 30, 40 years, what would it be like? Would it transition to water oak? Or some more non-flammable? So if you really want to prevent severe fires, why don't you just not burn it for 30 or 40 years? There's heresy in this room, I know. But if you really was using this for a justification in Florida, if you back off a place for a long enough time, there's some of these sites that will transition to very basic sites. Been burning I live on a piece of property that my family's been burning for many generations. And I can tell you, it's not the same piece of property that it was 20 years ago, flatwoods and dry prairie. And that whole idea of reintroducing fire to ecosystems, I can tell you, the ecosystems know fire. You don't need to reintroduce them. They already have a strong relationship with fire, no matter what fire comes. And it's the response that matters. But why, to get to the point of this little thing, is like, one of the main reasons why I would advocate monitoring of prescribed fire is to learn. To get past these abstracts and peer-reviewed papers. I do peer review for the Journal of Wildlife Management, and I look at the fire parts of it, and I pull my hair out because a fire is just a fire. The wildlife biologists will say X amount of acres were treated in June, blah, 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 but they don't characterize the site-specific effects of that fire. The other thing that I would pull off of this slide, and I'm assuming a high level of literacy here because most of you came out of the Florida school system, so you're brilliant at this point, is that we want to ensure that we do no harm. And because I work on a lot on the research end, the best research that we can get, instead of have somebody fly in out of their ivory tower and do a 2-year project on your place, from an idea that they hatched out. What if it was in reverse and you were doing your fire effects monitoring at a most basic scale, and then you promoted the needs that you had in terms of your research? And for any of you that are using that clunky old Behave Plus program to develop your burns, please God, do not show me. I do a lot of peer review or technical reviews for type 1 in complex prescribed fires, particularly with private firms and the U.S. Forest Service. And some of the prescriptions I see in those plans are legally dangerous because they're, I'll give you an example. Anybody use Behave in here? That's good news. I see some, especially in the Fed world, where they crank out a prescription with 7.2-foot flame lengths. And because I often have to give subject matter expert testimony, I can tell you that attorneys say, you guys are that good? 7.2 flame lengths? How did it get away from you? And mostly, and also in connection to learning, is to evaluate your existing assumptions, because we roll into our work when you first got to your job and you were first handed those smelly yellow shirts to do your work in, you probably didn't know a whole lot. And so where did you learn about fire? Probably for somebody on the fire line or your supervisor or something like that. Again, back to trust but verify. And because of the kind of rebel that I am, I would say question authority as well. For us, the practitioners here, I wanted to just say that we're making a promise to the ecosystems and the taxpayers and the people who are living off the land. Talk about goals and objectives. And, you know, what are they? Do your goals and objectives actually mean so? And if so, how do you know? I worked for the National Park Service for many years, and we got involved in a national fire effects monitoring program. And I can tell you we didn't do it out of the goodness of our heart. We got sued because we were burning the Sequoia National Park, and it looked ugly to the Californians. So the Sierra Club took us to task. We went to court, and the judge, we said, well, fire is good. We've got 2 research papers that say the seedlings from the sequoias take off after this. And the judge just asked us the question, how do you know? What evidence do you have? That's a legitimate question. So we got involved in fire effects monitoring. I want to ask you a few questions. You ever seen these, any of these statements as goals and objectives? Reintroduce fire, we talked about that, to dry prairie flatwoods and wetland ecosystems. Reduce hazardous fuels, burn in a mosaic pattern, whatever the F that is. And there's a lot of good research and critiques about mosaic patterns, particularly coming out of South Africa and other parts of the planet. Mimic lightning fires, okay, and burn a record amount of acres for our agency. Because some of us are on this acres treadmill, and acres are a poor metric. We want to protect our communities. We want to get fire in the ecosystems at the right time. And we want to do it safely. If there's 2 things I believe that's going to get the matches taken out of our hands, is smoke management, and the impact on species at risk, endangered species or others. That's one of my experiences, especially working down in South Florida, where it seems like we have 8 million lawyers to every 1 prescribed fire practitioner. So I want to encourage you to go down the road of specific, measurable, and attainable and time-oriented objectives. And if I review another burn plan with 8 freaking objectives on it, this old man's going to get grumpy again. I would ask you to be modest with your objectives. Start very simple, because sometimes some of your burns, if you meet that 1 objective, you're going to meet several more that are unstated. Often, particularly in the legal world or the critique world, it's easy for me to find conflicting objectives, and that goes to your credibility. Here's a better example of smart objectives, and I'm going to show you a place where we've used that. I could show that several examples where it's down in the Everglades, the southwest part of the United States, where I worked at Saguaro National Park, several other places. But you see what these objectives are doing. They reduce the fine fuels, measured immediately post-burn. You know this, you've burned enough to see that this is what happens. Limit flame lengths to less than 1 meter. Most of my work is in the metric world. Only the United States and the great country of Liberia are still using the system of feet. So anyway, these are specific objectives, and operationally, and this is the important part of this, operationally, if I gave you this objective in a drip torch, would you essentially know what to do? I think you would. I think operationally you could make it happen in a way that reintroducing fire or mimicking or mosaic patterns. The question I would have in a mosaic pattern: how big? What shape? What's the next mosaic pattern? And sometimes I think those patterns are actually kind of bet hedging. We don't know exactly what we want, so we'll burn a mosaic pattern. And I've drilled on mosaic patterns enough right now, but limit flame lengths to less than 1 meter. That's essentially 3 feet. When you're lighting, you can have that calculation. Not that we're going to be, sometimes it's going to be 2 meters, sometimes it's just going to be half a meter or just a few feet, but keep it in that 3 foot. So if you are lighting, you know that let's keep it toned down, let's space it in a way. And that's something that's often very, very difficult to do for a helicopter, with a helicopter. So here's the adaptive management loop, which is something that we use in almost every place I work, except very few places in North America. But we have to start with the idea that there's some things we don't know. We have to take action. We have to develop our objectives, and then plan our actions, then monitor it, and then analyze the data or our outcomes, and then do it again. And that's the beauty of what y'all got going on in Florida. You can do it over and over and over. You're on a bit of a fire treadmill. I look at the flat woods out the window of my house. I just burned them in June. And look at them now. You know what I'm talking about. They're all fluffed up. They're ready to go next time it gets dry enough. I want to take you to another place in another part of the world that where we've exercised this, and we've been able to implement prescribed fire monitoring to answer a few questions. The reason why I'm taking you down to Paynes Creek National Park, which is in Belize, Central America, is because it is so very similar to where we're at now. But we used some fire effects monitoring to answer questions that we had about the impacts on the ecosystem. This land is occupied mostly by the Maya, two different Maya tribes, and they've been burning this landscape for about 13,000 years as a travel route from the Caribbean Sea. That's the Caribbean right there where the ranger station is. So you might take a look at this landscape. This is the typical landscape there. Caribbean pine, wiregrass, and palmetto. Sound familiar to anyone? Structurally very, this old tree in the center of the frame, we did some dendrochronology work. It's about, I think it's about 824 years old. Very old tree. It was a British colony, and British left there in about 1981. In typical colonial style, they just cleaned house. Also in these pines, we have something called a yellow-headed parrot. Does anybody recognize that box that parrot's flying out of? Anybody got RCWs on your property? It's a nest box. We actually borrowed this idea from the Apalachicola National Forest because we needed large diameter pine trees for the parrots to nest. And of course, when the British cleaned everything out in 81, they took most of the large diameter trees, which caused the population of this parrot to crash. They need these old pine trees. Downside of this, the poachers know it. When they see these boxes, they grab the chicks. They're worth about 200 US a piece. And there's a thriving market in the United States for these friendly little folks. Here's a little map of the part of Belize that we're in. We're way down south. In Belize think and Central American think the Toledo district way down south might as well be Alaska. And one of the reasons is because it's very remote from the capital. And it's always good to be as far away from Tallahassee, the capital as possible. It's one of the state's coolest cities, though. I had to give it that. All of you got some kind of management plan on your shelf or on your computer. And I will just say this, I don't know if you've looked at it, but I would encourage you to look at your management plan and see if there's some improvements you can make. But they had a couple of goals in here. Use prescribed fires to replace damaging wildfires, restore uneven stand structures of Caribbean pines, and enhance the nesting environment for the yellow-headed parrot. Conduct prescribed burn operations and monitor to evaluate the reduction of fuel load and mitigate hardwood encroachment. That could be in some shape or form a goal for Florida. But managers there believed that high intensity fire was necessary to remove shrubs. I can tell you where they got that idea. They didn't have that idea until something happened. And what happened is a group of managers from Belize were brought to the United States, to a state called Florida. And one of their interpretations of their trip here was you need to burn hot to be able to get the ground ready for pine seedlings. You need to knock that brush back. But they realized that their objectives weren't being met. They continued to destroy important resources like nesting habitat, nesting cavities, the pine regeneration. Even Caribbean pine's a weird deal for a lot of reasons. But one of the things about Caribbean pine, and we'll see an image of this later, is it doesn't have the grass stage like some of our species do here in the United States. It's this tender little loblolly thing in the wiregrass. evolutionary ecological strategy is that in a fire-prone environment? It's quite curious, but they do persist, but we wanted to know why. So we wanted to develop a monitoring program just to answer some of these questions. And one of the things that we started doing, and this is Liberato here, one of my colleagues, and he's Maya as well, is measuring one of those Caribbean pines in the wiregrass there. Their wiregrass, we have quaint little wiregrass compared to what they have there. They have sequoia-sized wiregrass. I mean, in other words, it's robust, it's dense, and it will burn after 3 months. It will burn after we get an inch of rain on it and 2 hours of sunlight. So he's out there measuring a seedling in that bed of wiregrass. Here's the plot situation that we have there to be able to capture that. There's all kind of plots in the world. We went more what we call the full meal deal, but you don't have to do that. Nothing I'm advocating here. I know that you are busy. You've got all kind of chores falling off your plates, but there's also a way that you can get a good fire effects monitoring. And some of you may be doing this, is quantitative photo points, because now that everybody's carrying a camera and that beautiful black mirror in their pocket, you're able to do this. But I would encourage you to do it quantifiably. Sometimes when I look at these photos from the past in my career, we see one of the things you see in these photos is there's no people in them. One of the things I learned is if you have a 30-year-old photograph of yourself and ends up in a presentation, it's really embarrassing. People just don't wear sideburns and mullets the way they used to. So one of the things that we did that's just not done in this country too much in the state is we used the community members to help us set the monitoring protocols and objectives, because they have to live off the landscape. In much the same way that people who are visiting your parks and forests they have their own needs and perceptions out there. And one of the things I learned from working with the National Park Service, people's perceptions of nature are very interesting, as well as within the agencies. And one of the things that you see on the back side of the screen is actually a yellow-headed parrot was visiting us for some reason while we were doing this work. So we had monitoring questions, and I hope you do too. We wanted to know, are there management methods? In other words, this is all good science, Rick, or interesting to follow the effects of your fires, but what do we do about this? And so we wanted to ask the questions, are there management methods to manage fuels and diminish these impacts? So we placed plots throughout these different parts of the ecosystem, from a sparse open savanna all the way to a densely high basal area pine savanna. And one of the things that we found was, especially after the first year, it was really obvious, is that we were starting to see vegetation contributing to survival. In the open savannas, no survival. And in the grass shrub matrix, remember, they wanted to get rid of the shrubs. Now we were starting to see that this is where this is really operating at. We started seeing that the role of shrubs in protecting these pine seedlings is that the shrub cover, and again, you know this, you've seen ecotunes burn or not burn well. That's where the pine seedlings were hiding at, basically. That's where they were surviving, not in the open, highly flammable wiregrass savannas. And back to the flame lengths, we knew that if the flame lengths are greater than 3 feet, it would take these pines out. And we wouldn't have the next generation, because they also logged this national park, which is very different than a national park in the United States. It's sustainable logging. They leave the oldest trees, but the mid-story trees they use, and it's one of the biggest employers in the region in a place with not much employment. So this is what we found: low intensity prescribed fire. This should be no surprise to you folks. Reduced mortality in seedling pines. This was not exactly what they had believed going into this whole program of using fire. So high intensity fires, what they believe. They did some monitoring, and the results were these low intensity fires helped meet their objectives. There were many more objectives. I just wanted to select this one just for brevity. in this presentation. So we changed the fire management practice. Many of you might be working on sites where the fire management practices have not been changed ever. And also, I want to remind you, back to our horseback burning, most of you are on properties that were burned with matches and horseback for a very long time. So I would encourage you to think about, not that radical change is always the most desirable thing, but sometimes no matter how much we think we know about fire, we get surprises. Plus society, it's changing. Thankfully, we have, for example, we're in a so-called right to burn state. We can burn in Florida in ways that's very difficult in other places. I am fortunate. I live not far from the Palmdale forestry station and fire tower. Still have a fire tower in our part of the world. I can actually get, if I'm lucky and they're not engaged in training or wildfire response, I can get help from the Florida Forest Service to help me burn my place. We're fortunate in Florida. We've got the laws that support us, but there's some finesse, and I hope that's maybe one of the takeaways from this. There's some finessing we can do to enhance our capability. In other words, like a colleague of mine told me many years ago, and my mentor said, be a student of fire. Always learn, and that's the beauty. Not as much as many of our strips when we're lighting down the road, and we burned this unit 18 freaking times. It's never the same fire, is it? So when we get back to cargo cult thinking, is if you're imitating behaviors that's been handed down to you in that ecological and fire management phone game we've been playing, you may be mimicking things that are no longer useful anymore. Or things have changed, your objectives change, we learn more. So as an old gray fire dog, like I mentioned earlier, one of the beautiful things is that we continue to learn in fire management. That's what's kept me engaged in fire management all these years, and I hope it does to you too, because we're transforming the land, and at the heart of this, we're land managers. We will always be challenged here. And one of the things is Florida's growth in population, and as we become the New Jersey of the South. Did I say that out loud? That we'll have to be more skilled. But what people cared about 10, 20 years ago about fire management or your state parks or your state forest or your county parks, thank goodness that we're all in this together. But I think that it's well worth us thinking about, how do we up our game? How do we become sensitive? How do we conduct the art of fire by using the science of fire? And I'll leave it with this quote from the King James Version. And they shall go out from one fire and another fire shall devour them. I want to leave you with some encouraging words. Don't be devoured by fire. Thank you.